Hi, and welcome to a special Obama's second term edition of InstaVision. Are you looking forward to Obama's second term? God knows I am. And here with me to talk about what might happen and how we should think about it and what we should do about it is Nick Gillespie. He's the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine. He's widely known as a widely imitated snappy dresser. Like that look, Nick. And he's also the co-author of Declaration of Independence, How Libertarian Politics Can Fix What's Wrong with America. Well, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So what problems do we have that can be fixed by libertarianism?
Well, I think virtually anything in the political process. The message of the book, which I wrote with Matt Welch, who's actually the editor-in-chief of the magazine at Reason. I do online and TV now, the online platforms of the outfit. But, the basic message of that, and I think it's one that, is as true as it was in 2010 when we published the book originally. Everything should be decentralized. All decision-making should be decentralized as much as possible to the individual or groups of individuals who are, going to be most affected by something. So when you think about things like education policy, K through 12 education policy, a system that actually allowed parents and students to choose where they wanted to go to school would be much preferable to what we have now, where about 90% of kids go to traditional public schools that are just assigned to you based on where you live. In other areas, you can see how devolving decision-making and authority to the individual, or as close to the individual as possible, would also make sense. And by the flip side, also pushing responsibility onto people. When we look at things like the housing bubble and then the housing bust, a lot of that came from the fact that nobody involved in the system, whether it was the lenders, whether it was the people taking the mortgages, or the government agencies who were buying up all of the mortgages, none of them really had much skin in the game in terms of if these things went south, they figured they were going to get covered one way or the other. And that's a bad way to run a society.
All right, it certainly is. Now, you wrote yesterday that the current sort of gun control hysteria is like the hysteria that gave us the Patriot Act and other sort of rushed through legislative flops. Is a tragedy just an opportunity for the political class to grab power for itself?
Yeah, I mean, it clearly works out that way, and it's particularly offensive when we're talking about something like the school shooting in Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. Because there are a lot of people, and I think most of the people, and even a lot of the politicians, it's not that they're cynical about this. They're like, oh, finally, Dianne Feinstein is not saying, finally, here's a mass shooting that I can used to get across the same gun control policy that I've been pushing for 25 or 30 years. But there is some cynicism in this, and obviously we're all living still in the wake of Rahm Emanuel's suggestion that you never let a disaster go to waste. But opportunities do prevent, or rather disasters and tragedies, whether it's Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina, whether it's something like the Sandy Hook shooting or the 9/11 attacks. It allows government to do stuff that otherwise would not be possible. And people like Naomi Klein, who wrote about the shock doctrine, talked about disaster capitalism, about how, in the wake of economic disasters, capitalists could come in and kind of privatize and loot whole countries like Chile. She had it wrong. In fact, what more typically happens is something that at Reason we've called disaster socialism. After natural disasters, man-made disasters, other kinds of calamities happen, typically it's the role that the government plays that tends to expand. They spend a lot more tax money, they create more regulations, and they exercise more authority. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah, well, speaking of disasters, I mean, one thing I suggested yesterday in my USA Today column is that they want to talk about guns because when people are arguing and fighting about guns, they're not talking about the debt and the deficit and the sort of economic debacle that the political class has brought us to. Is it also about distraction, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it, and to add another kind of distraction dimension to things, I think that the nomination of Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense, who I actually like most of what Chuck Hagel has said about the military, and about the size of the Pentagon, but that's a distraction to keep us from thinking about John Kerry as the Secretary of State. It's a far more important position, and one that John Kerry is a much worse candidate for state than Chuck Hagel is for defense, I think, by anybody's measure, and yet we haven't talked about Kerry at all. But you're right. I mean, Obama has shown time and time again that he is interested in talking about anything but the economy. He's been saying since 2009 that jobs, jobs, jobs were his top priority, his only priority. He has done nothing to address the long-term economic issues facing the country other than to say, we're going to keep spending and spending and spending and give me more money to spend, more debt to incur. And we'll talk about this other stuff. I mean, the fact is that, he is saying in a way that is totally wrong historically, but also is just foolish on the face of it to say that a reauthorization or an increase in the debt limit is no time to talk about spending priorities in the country. I mean, are you kidding? And this is a guy who, for I believe, the third out of fourth years, has not been able to hand in his budget plan on time to Congress.
Yeah, I think they ought to condition the debt ceiling increase on passing a budget. Do you think we really have the worst political class in American history? I mean, I'm inclined to think so.
I think it's probably always the case that we're, 5 minutes before midnight, no matter what. And I do think, I have to admit that I didn't really care about politics until I was about 30 years old or so. So I can't really say what it was like going through the era of Nixon or of Reagan or of, whoever you want to talk about, much less, people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The one thing I will say is that we have a political class now that is inept in ways that is pretty extreme. We're talking about a government, a federal government, that has not been able to pass a budget and coming up on 4 years. Within that, the Senate Democrats have not even produced a budget to be voted on. Forget the idea that they had a document that they couldn't agree on. They haven't even shown us a document in 3 years. This is very, very disturbing, and this is a new level of ineptness, and you got to wonder what's going on with that. And you still hear people like Harry Reid, last year, he said, it wasn't a good time to bring up a budget plan to vote on, even though he is constitutionally and legally mandated to vote on a budget in the Senate. It's shocking to me, and I do think that this gun control stuff is one more way in which Obama is doing anything possible not to talk about actual spending on the part of the federal government, which is a very, very important pressing issue, and it's also something he could do something about. Nothing that he has proposed in terms of gun control, or anybody has proposed in terms of gun control, is going to fix what happened in Sandy Hook or address and avoid the next one.
Well, maybe there's some hope in the future. A lot of people say that Rand Paul will be kind of a libertarian force in the Republican Party in 2016, whether he runs or not, and I suspect he probably will. And I saw a column in Forbes today saying that actually Obama's just setting everything up for the next Reaganite or something like that. What's your take on that?
I like to believe that American society is dialectical. I think there's a lot of evidence for that, that we go from, white to black to, right to left, all of that kind of stuff in a predictable fashion. Here's a couple of things to think about. First off, Reagan wasn't so Reaganite. When you look at you take a longer view of his time in office, he increased spending massively. He raised payroll taxes significantly. He didn't cut government. He didn't decentralize or devolve power to the states, much less individuals. So I'm not sure we need we need another Reaganite. What we could use is somebody along the lines of what Rand Paul has talked about, which is cutting the budget so that we're actually spending less next year than we spent this year, which is what actually has happened. And this is where I think this is kind of mind-blowing, because a lot of people don't think about it, because it goes against the rhetoric of both the Republican and the Democratic Party. But if you look at the past 12 years, spending every year ramped up significantly under George Bush. And then in 2009, which was a transition year because there was a lot of TARP and a lot of government spending from Bush's last term that slopped over into Obama's first term, Obama got the stimulus. So in 2009, there was a final ratcheting up of government to the level we're at now, where we're spending $3.8 trillion. It has been flat under Obama, partly because of the incompetence of Congress. They haven't passed the budget, so they rely on continuing resolutions. Spending has been flat when you adjust for inflation and population growth. And, you know, that may be the solution, which is that the incompetence of government is keeping it from actually jacking up spending to the places where both the Republicans and the Democrats want to go. So,
Well, that's the most hopeful thing I've heard yet. All right, last question.
yes.
What's next at Reason?
We've got a ton of stuff going on at Reason. We've got a major cover, or not a cover package, but in a forthcoming issue, we're actually going to be dealing with your argument about the education bubble, the higher education bubble, which and we've called in a bunch of people to discuss whether or not there is a higher education bubble, how big is it, how do you pop it or release the air out of it slowly, what's the problem with the higher education bubble. So that's down the road a bit. And then beyond that, we have been really working hard to talk about things like gun control and fiscal policy in realistic, fact-based ways that also offer up actual solutions. This is one of the problems. There's too many times people are ready to throw up their hands and say, oh, there's nothing we can do that will work, so let's just try everything, or all is darkness, so why give up? I mean, I think libertarianism, broadly defined as, you know, free minds and free markets, is in a golden age because we're the only kind of mindset or perspective that hasn't been totally tried and totally found wanting. And we're offering up at Reason.com and Reason TV real solutions to the problems that are facing the country.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Glenn.
That was Nick Gillespie. He's the editor-in-chief of Reason.com, and as I say, widely known as a widely imitated snappy dresser. He's the co-author with Matt Welch of Declaration of Independence, How Libertarian Politics Can Fix What's Wrong with America. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.